That was close. It's F4, F3, GP3, GP2, Formula E, and WTCC. So, thank you everyone. I'm an entrepreneur. In college realized I wanted to start a company, and I've spent the last 16 years building several companies, and recently joined Oxford as a resident expert, and it's caused me to kind of step back and think about what have I learned in the last 16 years as an entrepreneur. There's been extraordinary things about it, incredibly positive, emotional things about it, but also some very, very challenging things associated with it as well. So I just wanted to share what I've learned, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So I want to tell a story. When I first got out of college, I took a job, and the CEO became my mentor, and I started asking him, I want to start my own company, I want to be a CEO one day, what should I do? And he said, well, Emmet, you probably should work your way up within the marketing organization and become a CMO, and then you should go get your MBA, and then after that, you can be a CEO. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. So I started actually running down that path, and then one day I was looking at his bio, and it said CMO, MBA, Stanford, CEO, and I realized that was his path. That's not necessarily going to be my path. So what I want to say before I get started here is this is sort of my perspective and my experience. Take it with a grain of salt, because yours is going to be very different. So for me, and this was kind of in the mid-90s, I started thinking about what I wanted to do, this company I was going to start, what was it going to be? And for whatever reason, and I'm not sure even today why this happened, the first thing that came to my mind was to try and figure out what makes me happy, and can I build a company that's somehow related to what makes me happy. For me, and as I thought about this, for a few years, I realized that actually what makes me happy is cars. I'm one of these kids who had Matchbox cars and Corgis and made models and wanted to buy my own car when I was 14, and I've been obsessed on it ever since I was a little kid. And I got really interested in racing when I was in college. I realized that maybe if I wanted to set an extraordinary dream for myself that would make me happy, I should try and start a Formula One team and win the world championship. That's sort of the craziest thing you can possibly think of when it comes to racing, so that became my goal and dream. So once that became clear, I set another crazy goal, and I had been gravitating towards technology for the 10 years out of college, and I set a goal that I wanted to start a software company, take it to $1 billion in turnover, and then I figured that would allow me to get into Formula One. So in 1998, we started a company called iRise, and in the software world, there's two kinds of companies you can start. One is a consumer type software play, and that would be like an Instagram or a Facebook or a Pandora, or you can start an enterprise software company, which is like a Salesforce or an SAP, or something that sells into the IT organizations within large companies. So we made a decision to start a company on the enterprise side, and we started looking at large IT shops and asking the question, what are they really struggling with when it comes to software? And bizarrely, in the year 2000, we had this insight that nobody had thought of the idea of simulation or computer-aided design applied to software. If you're designing a Formula One car or a helicopter or a building, computer-aided design and visualization is a common thing that you would do during the design process. But we realized strangely that nobody had thought of this for software. So we ended up inventing a market for software simulation, and now we have about 1,000 of the largest companies in the world that are actually simulating their software before they build it. We're not quite $1 billion in turnover yet, we have a long ways to go, but we've been successful, and we'll see where things go from here. So I was very fortunate that when I decided I wanted to start my own company, I had several years to ask a lot of questions about it. And one of the things I heard was the business partner is the most important thing that you can do when it comes to starting a company, and you actually have to think of that business partner as a marriage. So this is probably one of the best pieces of advice I can give you if you're thinking about starting a company, is just know that when you start something with someone, that's basically a business marriage, and you have to take it that seriously. And I actually spent a couple years getting to know my business partner, and we wrote all kinds of questions and things about ourselves, and really made sure that we had the right fit before we started the company. The interesting thing about partnerships in business is that it's actually also similar to a marriage in that opposites attract. And that's what ended up happening to me is I'm a sales-oriented, marketing-oriented, business development-oriented, people-oriented type person, like explaining things and getting out there in the world. My business partner is the exact opposite. He's a hardcore introvert, doesn't really like dealing with people necessarily. He's good at it when he has to, but it's not really what his first calling would be. And he also loves details, I don't, and there's many, many things about us that are completely opposite, which is what's made our relationship so extraordinary over the years. Something we did early on is we thought about what are all the types of background that we don't have any experience in. And this is one of the smartest things we did when we started the company is we got a CFO on board, we got a head of engineering on board, we got a academic expert, a government expert, a marketing expert, all these folks that had actually been there, done that. And one of the things I found that was really extraordinary is that when people are successful, they want to give back. They're happy to help. They're happy to join an advisory board. Whether they get paid or not, they really don't care. They just want to help. And so we ended up forming a really extraordinary advisory board, which was one of the smartest things we ever did. Something I'll never forget is we developed a product early on that we thought was interesting. And I went to one of my advisors who was a guru. He actually was a co-founder of Oracle, and I think he's been co-founder of 4 different billion-dollar companies. And I started showing him this idea for the product and asking him, what do you think about it? What do you think? What do you think about the solution? And he said, I don't know why you're talking to me about it. He said, have you talked to your customers about it? Have you asked them what they think about it? And I realized, no, we really hadn't done that. And then he said, and also you shouldn't be talking about the solution, you should be talking about what problem you want to solve and make sure that the customers actually have the problem before you go build a solution for it. Well, it turned out once we started interviewing customers, the solution was totally irrelevant. It didn't solve a problem that they had. That was an extraordinary piece of advice that helped us get to where we are today. I was recently in Aspen at a really fascinating entrepreneur conference, and there was a venture capitalist there who has been extraordinarily successful. He was one of the first investors in Twitter and Alibaba, and over the years, many, many different companies. And I asked him, what's the common thing that you see? You know, when you see an entrepreneur who's pitching you on an angel investment, what's the pattern there? And he said, every single company that's been successful has a founder who's extremely passionate about a problem. And I thought that was really interesting. Turns out that Uber, you know, one of the co-founders of Uber, was just really, really frustrated with taxis. He was in Paris, you know, trying to get taxis, and I'm sure many of you know how challenging that can be in Paris. And that's really what inspired him to start Uber, is he just wanted to solve that problem. So, again, something to think about. I've had many entrepreneurs pitch me, and they tend to pitch the solution, not the problem. So here's another interesting one. A lot of times people ask me, what should we do? Should we bootstrap the business? Should we raise venture money for it? Should we start as a consulting firm and transform into a software company? You know, they're trying to figure out what should we do. And what I always say to them is, start with the end that you're trying to get to, and then work it backwards from there. So for example, if you want to build a company, spend 3 years of your life, sell it for 30 million, that's a very specific strategy that it will take to get to that within 3 years. If you want to spend 20 years of your life building a business and you're really patient about liquidity, etc., that's a very different strategy. So this is a really good piece of advice when you're starting a company. This is another one, and this is something I didn't know when I first started iRise, and that is the minute you take money, you're not really working for yourself anymore. You work for the investors at that point. And it's really an important distinction as an entrepreneur to understand. Many people who become entrepreneurs want to do it because they want to be on their own, they don't want to answer to anybody, you know, they don't work well with others, etc. And I really didn't understand this fully when we first took our first money, is that you now answer to the investors and they are who you work for. So really important if you're thinking about when to take money, if you want to take money. And this is another one. And again, I wish I had known this back then, but investors are marriages too. I mean, our business, we've been around now for 16 years. We're married to our early angel investors, and we have a few that I wouldn't have married if I thought about it that way back in the days. You know, we have a couple very, very challenging investors. So again, you have to really analyze and spend a lot of time making sure that it's the right relationship. Even if they have a checkbook and a pen and they're getting ready to write you a check for $100,000, you have to say, no, let's make sure this is a good fit for each other. So another one that I've learned over the years is that bootstrapping is slow and really easy compared to taking venture capital. It takes longer to get there, but it can give you more time to figure out the business and really unlock growth in the business. Venture capital is the exact opposite. When you take money, if you take a $5 million Series A, you're jumping off a building and you've got a very short amount of time to get that business where it needs to go, or the business is going to go out of business, or you'll be out of a job. It's a very, very hard and fast maneuver when you take venture capital. This is something, when I grew up, my father really only told us two things several thousand times. One was, be nice. So anytime I would beat up on my younger brother or throw my sister off a wall or whatever it was, I'd get a lecture about being nice, and he lectured us for years and years about that. The other thing he said was go for it. He didn't care what we did, but he wanted to know that we were giving it everything we had. My business partner, as it turns out, when he grew up, the rule in the house was do good work and do the right thing. So very nice synergy there, the way we grew up. Along the way, as an entrepreneur, you'll have opportunities to make the wrong decisions. For example, in 2002, we needed to raise 11 million. And I don't know, as many of you know, 2002 was the absolute worst time in history to raise money in the high-tech business because the dot-com bubble had just burst. So we were raising money in this very challenging environment. We had about 5 million committed, and we were basically running out of money. We were staring at maybe 30 days before we had to shut the business down. We had raised some of that money at a certain type of structure and a certain price, and an investor came along who said, I'll write you guys a check for $6 million. And we said, fantastic, that's great. We said, the only problem is it has to be at this price and it has to be at this structure. And he said, oh, it's perfectly fine, I'll do it that way. So we spent time getting to know him to see if the marriage was right. And then in the very end, as he had the check in hand and the pen was hitting the paper, he said, sorry, I'm not going to do that price and I'm not going to do that structure. And so we had to make a tough decision. Do we take that money, which we desperately needed, and do the wrong thing for the previous investors, or do we do the right thing and say no? And of course, we said no, which was one of the scariest decisions of our lives. And it turns out that one of the investors who had put in the first $5 million wrote a check for $6 million because he was so happy that we had done the right thing. So you'll have many opportunities to make sure and do the right thing. Here's another one. When you're an entrepreneur, you want to entrepreneur everything, including the people that you hire. We did some really dumb things, like we hired someone to run HR who had never run HR before. We hired someone to be our CMO who had never done that before. We hired a head of sales that had never done that before. And these are just lessons you learn in your early 20s when you're trying to be an entrepreneur. And what I've learned is that you have to hire absolutely world-class people. And if you talk to successful entrepreneurs in the Silicon Valley, the first thing they'll talk to you about is the people they've hired, not the problem they're solving, not the solution they have. So this is super critical. And then sometimes, when you're an entrepreneur, you're playing ping pong together, foosball, you're staying up all night, eating pizza, all that kind of stuff. You become very close friends with people in the business that you work with. Another thing I've learned over the years is you have to make tough decisions early. When you find out that somebody is not getting it done or there's something wrong there in the relationship, you have to make the tough decision and get that person out of the business, or it can be very damaging if you don't. Another thing that we've learned, and this is some of this stuff seems really obvious, but when you're an entrepreneur, you're moving so fast and it's so emotional that you don't always think about the basics. And this is another thing that we've realized. And that's really, at the end of the day, the product is the root of all opportunity. And you have to stay focused on that every step of the way. No matter what type of product you're bringing to market, you always have to remember it's the root of all opportunity. Another one seems obvious, but when you're starting a company, you really have to think about how big is the market for this product? Are there 10,000 people out there, 50,000, a million? Like in Facebook's case, 7 billion. You really have to spend time thinking about that and make sure that it's a big enough market for what you're trying to accomplish. This is probably one of the single biggest lessons that I've learned, and that is distinguish between a better, faster, cheaper play and create a market category play. Google was a better, faster, cheaper play as it compared to Yahoo. Everyone already knew what a search engine was. Google came along and said, I've got a better mousetrap for the search engine. Facebook was a better, faster, cheaper play over MySpace. Everyone knew what social was. Facebook had a better mousetrap for social. And this is something that, this is probably the single biggest lesson I've learned over the last 16 years, is doing a better, faster, cheaper play is way, way easier than trying to start a new market category. Starting a market category is like the automobile versus horse and carriage. There's many other examples where you're doing something that's never been thought of before, and it takes a lot of time to explain, what that new idea is. In our case, even though simulating software seems like such an obvious thing, the first ever article that was written about iRise the title was, "Why didn't I think of that?" ? It's so obvious. But having said that, because it's a new market category, we've spent the last 16 years evangelizing that it's better than writing the requirements in a Word document, and believe it or not, we're still evangelizing that every day. Another one, really interesting, when you're starting a company, it's way, way, way easier to ride a wave than to be out there just paddling on flat waters. So for example, when mobility came out, and mobility was hot, and Apple invented the iPhone, that's a wave that you can ride and do some really interesting things on that wave. In today's world, cybersecurity is a giant issue. I'm sure many of you have seen, there's been some violations out there, whether it's WellPoint or Target, what have you. It's a huge topic. That's a wave that you can ride. If you come up with a new cybersecurity idea, you can just jump up on that wave. For us, turns out simulation, there hasn't been a wave that we can ride yet. And therefore, I always tell people, it's been like climbing Mount Everest. I mean, it's one step after another because we've never been up on a wave. So think about that if you're starting a company, and make sure that there's a wave you can jump up on. Very obvious, but you'd be surprised, when I get approached by entrepreneurs that are starting companies and you ask the question, who's got the sales DNA? Who's the expert in sales? A lot of times you get the answer, nobody. We don't have anybody who really understands that. This is super critical. It's a very important skill. Make sure you have it on your leadership team. Another thing we've learned, and this is really the last probably 10 years, this has become very clear in the high-tech space, and that is that the easier way to start software companies is when the users are adopting it bottom up. You have a really elegant product, it's inexpensive, easy for people to get their hands on, and you can get bottom-up groundswell. That's a much easier way to take a product to market than trying to sell it top-down within your organization. Same thing with marketing. In today's world, viral marketing, social marketing, all the skills that it takes to market a technology is really an art, and it's critical that somebody on the entrepreneur team has expertise in marketing. And then another interesting thing, when you're starting a company as an entrepreneur, you want to entrepreneur everything. All kinds of ideas are coming your way, and no one's giving you any constraints because you don't work for anybody, and sometimes you'll find yourself running in a bunch of different directions. One of the best pieces of advice I can give you is just make sure that you're very, very focused on a specific problem, you have a specific solution for it, and everything you're doing is very specific, is critical. And along with that, when you get your first customers, what venture capitalists want to see is there a pattern between these customers? Are they all large corporations? Are they medium-sized corporations? Are they small companies? Who's adopting this product? Make sure that your early customers have a pattern, otherwise it'll be hard to raise money. And this is really the biggest lesson of all that we've learned over the years, and that is that growth is really what matters in the end with a business. If you're going to ultimately be able to raise money, be able to go public or sell the business or whatever the outcome is, you absolutely have to have hypergrowth. And something you should wake up every day worrying about is how do I make this company grow faster? And in the end, great companies get bought. These crazy stories like WhatsApp and Instagram, et cetera, they built extraordinary companies and those are bought. In the end, if you're not growing and you're struggling, it's the poor companies that ultimately get sold. And that's not the position that you want to be in. So switching gears, almost done, just a few just more personal insights. One thing I've done, thankfully, along the way is always mix balance into my life. I drive race cars, which is incredibly fun and good for the mind. Started a band recently and play the drums and take time for that, travel the world. So make sure if you're going to be an entrepreneur, which is an extreme vocation, make sure you weave whatever makes you happy into your life. The other thing I've learned is I didn't give back early enough, and this happened when my father passed away about 3 years ago, and I stepped back to think about, what do I want to change in my life? I realized that I wasn't giving back, and so I ended up picking two things that he cared about, international peace and climate change, and I've been aggressively investing and giving back in those areas. And in hindsight, what I've learned is I should have been doing that a lot earlier in my life. So start it now in high school, when you're in college, do it, and all the way through, make sure you're giving back. I said two stories here, but I'll give you one because I know we're going long. Actually, they're both pretty funny, so I'll tell you both of them. One of them was, we had just started the company, we got a customer, they were paying us a lot of money, we were bootstrapping, we didn't take any money, we hired 10 employees, everything was going great. So my business partner and my wife, who was pregnant with my oldest son, Emmet, we went down to the Caymans and we were super fired up. We're talking about buying Ferraris and just pumped, right? Because things were going so well. Well, while we were gone, our executive sponsor at that customer got fired. His whole leadership team got fired, and we got thrown out when we were down in the Caymans. So when we came back, we had basically 30 days to live as a business. So I ran down to the bank, took a mortgage on the house, and remember, my wife is pregnant with Emmet. And so I'm pulling money out of the house to give us 60 days to live, and we basically were up almost every night for 60 days trying to figure out how do we save this thing. Ultimately, one night we had the idea, we were living in LA at the time, we had the idea, why don't we go up to the Bay Area? So I just left and went up to the Bay Area, and in the end we found 2 customers and the business ended up exploding. That was a near-death experience. Another funny story was we actually started as a consulting firm building software, and then we transitioned into a software company. And in the year 2000, January 2000, which is right before the bubble burst, we decided to start investing heavily in this software product. And I had to raise that 11 million between 2000 and 2002 to get this software company off the ground. Well, as the dot-com bubble was bursting and then 9/11 happened, our board and our investors were getting angrier and angrier, and the board meetings were getting hotter and hotter because they kept saying, retrench back into your consulting business and stop trying to build this simulation business. And we felt so strongly that we had a game-changing idea that we just kept saying, no, we're about to get our first customer, give us 30 more days. Well, in March of 2002, the entire board resigned, our CFO resigned. I was trying to close that money. I had just found that investor who wanted to put in $6 million, and just as we're trying to close the money, everybody resigns. And this is another one where we first drove up to the top of a mountain and just stared out at the Silicon Valley for hours. Then we went up to Tahoe and we're just staring at a creek trying to figure out what do we do now. And in the end, my business partner and I looked at each other and said, screw it, let's do it. So we disclosed everything in the documentation, got the money, and then the business lifted off from there. So just a couple stories that tells you as an entrepreneur, it's not for the faint of heart. It's a very hardcore profession, and you'll have many experiences like that. So finally, this one's very personal. I got a phone call in the year 2008, and I get phone calls all the time from people who want us to sponsor their kids in go-karts or drag racing or speedboat racing, whatever. And I always take the phone call just to see what is this thing. Well, that time, it was a couple of guys that wanted to start an American Formula One team. They wanted to build the car in America, have Americans driving it, get American sponsors, and this would be the first time since 1967 that there had been an American-made Formula One car. And I couldn't figure out for a while what they wanted from me. You know, did they want iRise to sponsor the car? Did they want me to write a check? Well, it turns out what they needed was somebody to raise money to get the team off the ground. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. If you make me a co-founder and if you give me 20% of the business, I'll do it. And they said, okay. I then set up 4 dinners, and I was planning on getting 80 investors to all write checks, but in the end, one investor stepped forward and said, I'll do it if you let me do the whole thing. So he wrote a multi-tens of millions check. We became a Formula One team. In the end, they selected Richard Branson, and Virgin was selected, we were selected, and there was one other team selected. So my dream of starting a Formula One team came true. But in the end, we couldn't get the car built fast enough. We had basically, by the time we got the money and we signed the Concord Agreement, we had 7 months to design, manufacture, test, and deploy these race cars. And in the end, we couldn't get there. So March of 2010, we ultimately had to shut that business down. And it was so painful that I thought about just saying, check, you know, my dream was to start a Formula One team. I did it. I was thinking about just, you know, writing it off, but in the end, I said no. The dream is actually to win the Formula One World Championship, and a bunch of us came together and we're going to give it another shot here in the coming years. So with that, just a little bit of insight into the life of an entrepreneur. So thank you very much.